Don't go anywhere because it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, doing a little double duty here. All right, guys, you're going to love hearing from Dr. Laurie Santos. So she is a professor here, and her class, for example, is the highest rated class in Yale in 300 years, is it? Okay, right, and I guess many of you guys are also podcast listeners. I know I am, and so she is a host of the Happiness Lab podcast. So it is my distinct pleasure to invite you. I could go through your bio, but look, you've gotten awards from Popular Sciences magazine, Brilliant 10 Young Minds, Leading Campus Celebrity. You've been in basically every publication there is. So let me hand over the reins to you and say thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Appreciate
Santos.
it. Thank you all so much. So my job today is to convince all of you insight leaders that focusing a little bit more on happiness, both for yourselves, your teams, and I think your customers, would be a good idea. What I'm going to do today is introduce you to why I think a lot about the science of happiness and why I think focusing on happiness is so important. But I'll also spend some time, I think I have 20 minutes, to quickly go through a version of my Yale class, this sort of famous Yale class, just for insight leaders. But it's like the 20-minute version, which is fun because you don't have to take the SAT again. You don't have to pay the Yale tuition. It's kind of the real Cliff Notes version. But what I hope to give you today is strategies that you all can use to find more of this, and things you should be thinking about as you want to bring this into your organizations and for folks that are buying the brands that you're focused on and so on. And so just to kind of get started, as mentioned, I teach here at Yale. I've been teaching here for over 2 decades. But in those 2 decades, I spent a lot of time with students on campus. I became what's called the head of college, which means I live on campus with students, was kind of eating with them in the dining hall, hanging out with them really closely. And what I started to see was this so-called college student mental health crisis up close and personal, which is a real thing. Right now, nationally, more than 40% of college students report being too depressed to function most days. Right now, nationally, more than 60% of college students say that they feel overwhelmingly anxious, right? And these are the folks that are in college right now, but might be in your organizations very soon. And so I was dealing with this crisis on campus and thought, well, why don't me as a psychologist, why don't I give students some strategies that they can use to feel a little bit better? And that was why I came up with this class. I'm not a marketer, but I was like, I should make the class sound kind of cool and have a brand. So I christened it Psychology and the Good Life, so it would sound kind of funky to students and so on. But it was a new class on campus. I didn't know what would happen, but I was excited to find that lots of students flocked to this new brand. We had over a quarter of the entire Yale student campus take the class when it was first offered, which I think is important. It tells us our college students are voting with their feet, and they don't like this culture of feeling overwhelmed and anxious and depressed, and they really wanted some solutions. So that's how I got interested in this. But what I want to spend my time on today is, I think, the Cliff Notes version of my class for insight leaders. What are the 5 insights from the science of happiness that you all should take into your own work moving forward? And I think there are a few that are important, but I'll start with what I think is the most important, kind of insight number 1. I'm using insights to kind of fit in. You see my sort of subtle brand move? So good, right? But the most important insight, I think, is one that shows that happiness kind of matters. It matters more for our performance than we think. I think we can get this idea of focusing on our mental health wrong, where we think, well, I'll perform really well, I'll do really well, I'll either make some money or do really well in my job, and then I'll become happy over time. I might have to sacrifice some things like sleep and my social connection to get there, but if I do really well and perform really well, I will be happy. What we don't think is that the causal arrow could go in the other direction. I focus on my positive emotion, I focus on my social connection, I focus on my mental health, and then I'll perform better. Then I'll get all those successes I wanted in the first place. But it turns out that studies have looked at this, and there's evidence that the causal arrow does go in that direction. If you focus on happiness at time 1, you will get the kinds of things you want in terms of your performance in time 2. How do we know that? Well, we know that from lots of studies that have looked at whatever you might think of as the performance bottom line. Take, for example, job obtainment. We all want folks to get a job. When you all were out looking for a job, you probably wanted a job. What are the things that predict whether or not you're going to get one? All the LinkedIn skills and so on. What you don't think is that it's your cheerfulness. But that's what researcher Ed Diener at the University of Virginia studied. He measured college students' cheerfulness at age 18 and used that to predict college students' job obtainment, not at age 18, but later at age 25 and later at age 35. And he found that those college students who self-reported being most cheerful were the ones that not only were more likely to get a job in their 20s and 30s, but they were also more likely to get a job that they enjoyed, and they got a job that paid them the most money. We all like to think that more money would make us happy. Turns out it's not as simple as that. But we don't tend to think that being happy will get us more money. But the studies seem to show that that's true too. Why? It's not some weird manifesting thing. It's not that HR is doing something kind of weird where they're just like paying the happy people more money. That would be kind of screwy too. No, it's that if you are happier, you come up with more innovative solutions. You are more creative. One of my favorite studies that looked at this, studied this not in insight leaders, but in medical doctors. Bring medical doctors into the lab and give them a really tough medical diagnosis problem. The kind of thing, if you remember that TV show, House MD, where they have like these weird medical problems, something like that. Doctors get these tough problems, but half the doctors just get to be in a good mood first. They watch some silly cat videos on YouTube and they're laughing. What happens? The doctors who are in the good mood statistically came up with the most innovative solutions to the tough problems. They were the ones that figured it out. And you kind of know that, right? Remember the last time you were just feeling totally overwhelmed, there's just too much on your plate, there's just lots of negative emotion. You're not thinking broadly, you're not coming up with the best new strategy, you're triaging, you're tossing stuff off your plate. We get that our mood and our happiness matters for our performance, but we forget how important it is. That's at the individual level, but there's lots of very cool new work coming out showing that if your organization focuses on having happier workers, you wind up performing better as an organization in all of the metrics that matter for organizations, right? Like your stock prices. How do we know this? Well, we know this from one very clever study that was done in collaboration with the University of Oxford and the job website Indeed. How many folks have been on Indeed and know this job website? If you don't, it's basically one of these websites where you can rate all this stuff. You can rate your salary, you can rate your work-life balance, but you can also rate your happiness. And these folks at Oxford said, wait a minute, there are 15 million data points on Indeed of people rating their happiness on the job across 5,000 different companies. I wonder if there's a correlation between a company's, say, stock performance and your average happiness at work. And so this is the graph that they plotted to come up with this. I'm putting the company's profit on this axis, and I'm also showing this Indeed well-being source. So bigger numbers are higher well-being on average for a company. And you can see there's a pretty strong correlation there where happier companies are earning the most money. These researchers said, well, if that's true, then maybe we need a new index. Like not the NASDAQ or the S&P 500, maybe we need like the top 100 happiest companies index. Maybe we should invest in those companies because they're going to make the most money. And here's the graph that shows the effect of this. This is how much money you would make if you invested $1,000 initially, I think as a start of 2020, in these different indexes. The normal ones that you probably have investments in, S&P 500, Dow Jones, NASDAQ. But the blue line is this new index from these Indeed data. This is the top 100 happiest companies in their data set as an index. And what you can see is the blue index of the top happiest countries is outperforming all the other ones at pretty much every point in the last 5 years. They now have data that go out even further than 2023, and it's continued like into 2025. There's some investment advice from the happiness lady, which you didn't think you would get, but congratulations, you get this. Invest in happier companies, you'll make some money, but make your organization a happy organization, and you'll get everybody performing better, right? And so this is, I think, maybe the most important insight from this work, is that this is not a nice to have. This is kind of a need to have in the modern day. If we're leaving our mental health on the side, if we're not protecting our positive emotion, we're losing opportunities to perform better. And it's one of the reasons I often start my talks with an image that looks like this. I think we need to put our happiness and our mental health and our positive emotion front and center. But how do we do that? How do we do that for ourselves? How do we do that for our organizations? And that's what the rest of the 5 tips are about. Starting with insight number 2, which is that if we want to be happier, research suggests that we just have to get more social. Pretty much every available study of happy people suggests that happy people are more social, they spend physically more time with other people, and they prioritize time with their friends and family members. And experiments where you force people to be a little bit more social, they wind up being a little bit happier too. But there's a second way that other people can influence our happiness. It's by doing nice stuff for other people. Research really shows that kindness can actually boost our happiness, which goes against the kind of cultural wisdom right now. I think we need some brand awareness to kind of promote kindness and pro-sociality, because right now, like a lot of the rhetoric that we see on TikTok and so on is not about doing nice stuff for others. It's about doing nice stuff for ourselves. You've probably heard terms like treat yourself if you watch Parks and Rec, or self-care, self. Turns out that's not what happy people seem to be doing. Happy people seem to be spontaneously doing nice stuff for other people. Controlled for income, people who donate more money to charity tend to be happier than those who self-report not donating that much to charity, right? Those are all correlations, but they're also experiments that kind of force people to do nice stuff for others, and it finds they tend to increase their mood relative to doing nice stuff for yourself. One of my favorite studies on this was done by Elizabeth Dunn and her colleagues. She does a very fun study for subjects where she just walks up to people on the street and hands them 20 bucks, which is a fun study to be in because you just randomly get some money. But the key is that she tells you how to spend this money. She either says, by the end of the day, I want you to do something nice to treat yourself, or by the end of the day, I want you to spend this money on someone else. You can buy a coworker a latte, you can donate it to charity, you gotta do something nice for somebody else. What does she find? At the end of that day, and even at the end of the week, those folks who donate the money to someone else, who do something nice for others with it, wind up happier than those that spent the equivalent amount to do something that was about self-care, that was about treating themselves. And so I think this is top insight number 2 that we need to take on board in our organizations, in our own lives, and maybe as we think about our customers. If we can be doing something that allows them to become more social, to do things that are other-oriented, you'll get a kind of positive joy that will come from that. That's not necessarily what we predict, but it's what the data really show. Third insight that I think insight leaders need to take on board if they want to feel happier, and this might be a very tricky one, is that you need to find ways to be more in the present moment. You got to kind of savor all the good things. And I think this is hard in general, but I think it's particularly hard for insight leaders because y'all have to be thinking about all kinds of things. Y'all have to be thinking about all these different brands and what's going on in the industry and all this movement all the time. This act of thinking about a billion things at once is what researchers like Dan Gilbert and his colleagues have referred to as mind wandering. Turns out we spend a lot of time doing this. In fact, some of Dan Gilbert's estimates suggest that we spend just under 50% of all of our waking hours thinking about what's not going on in the here and now, what you're going to have for breakfast, that spreadsheet you've got to work on later, that weird thing your spouse said, anything but the present moment. And Dan finds that this has a happiness cost, because every time we're not thinking about the present moment, every time we're mind wandering, we end up a little bit less happy. In other words, if you're going to deep in the trenches and flow on some boring spreadsheet, that actually feels better emotionally than thinking about something else. And so to be a little bit happier, we need to find ways to get back into the present moment, to notice what's going on, especially when we're dealing with good things. But the research also shows that we need to find ways to deal with the present moment when we're dealing with bad things. We need to be in the present moment, even if the present moment is feeling pretty awful. And I don't know y'all present moments lately, but mine haven't been feeling so hot, right? You know, it's normative in this world right now to be feeling anxious, to be feeling frustrated, to be feeling overwhelmed. I think in the worlds of insight leaders, it is normative to be feeling confused and worried with the economy imploding in the way it is. These are normal emotions, but they don't feel good. And so our move is to kind of squish them down, pretend they're not there, try to get rid of them. But we'd be better off if we actually listened to these emotions and tried to figure out ways, healthy ways to get through them better. But how can we do that? Well, one of my favorite practices falls under the title of a set of clinical practices that go by the term radical acceptance, where you find ways to radically accept whatever you're going through. And one of my favorite very practical strategies for doing this is a meditation practice that goes by the acronym of RAIN, which stands for Recognize, Allow, Investigate, and Nurture. It's been popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach. But here's how it goes. Imagine you get an email from a colleague that seems pretty frustrating. You look in the news and read literally anything, right? You notice, hey, I'm feeling a negative emotion right now. And you've already done the first step of this practice, RAIN, which is R, to recognize. What I want you to do is to recognize what is happening in your body, categorize that emotion, and use all the creative skills you have as like kind of insight leaders to figure this out. Is it pissed off with a side of loneliness? Maybe it's anxious with a side of a tiny bit annoyed with your spouse. Whatever it is, right? Talk about it, label it. That's the recognize step. But the next step, the second one, is the hard one. That's the allowing part. You say, and pissed off with a side of loneliness, I'm just going to let you be there just as it is. I'm not going to judge you. I'm just going to let myself feel you in my body. But you give your brain something to do while you're doing that. And that's the third step, investigate. You say, I'm going to get very curious, just like you do about brands and all the market stuff you study. You do that about what your body is feeling. You say, I'm going to investigate what this feels like. Maybe my jaw's getting tight. Maybe I'm clenching. Maybe I'm breathing really fast. Maybe I have a strong craving to have a drink or check my email. Don't act on that. Just notice where your mind goes. And this step works because clinicians will tell you that our emotions, our cravings, they're often like a wave. They'll feel more intense, but then they kind of go down. Problem is we never let ourselves do that. But you don't end even when you've investigated and your emotion subsides. You end with this last step, nurture. What can you take off your plate? How can you be a little self-compassionate with yourself? Researchers have studied practices like RAIN and radical acceptance in groups like palliative care workers, first responders, and they find it can reduce burnout in these populations. So if it can reduce burnout there, I imagine it can also be helpful for insight leaders too. And so that's top insight number 3. We got to find ways to be in the present moment, even if it's not feeling so hot. Top insight number 4 builds on that last step of RAIN, that nurture step. And it suggests that if we really want to motivate ourselves well, if we want to perform well, but also feel good, we might need to find ways to do that with a bit more self-compassion. I'm kind of simulating the folks in the insight leader field, but my guess is that you all, like a lot of the Yale students I teach, are a little bit type A, are a little bit intense. You want to perform very well. You want to push yourself. And sometimes the way we think we can do that best is to kind of start screaming at ourselves in our brain and tell ourselves we're a loser, we suck, et cetera, et cetera. Researchers have tested whether this works. Turns out, no, screaming at yourself makes you feel crappy, but it also doesn't make you perform better, you procrastinate, and so on. So what's a better strategy that will help us perform better, but will also feel better? And what researchers like Kristen Neff and her colleagues have come up with is there's a practice we can use that goes under the heading of self-compassion, the idea of treating ourselves like we would treat a friend. As I said, I kind of like these things that have steps, since Kristen Neff has broken self-compassion down into 3 critical steps. The first is one that you kind of have already seen before, mindfulness, being present. This sucks right now. This is really hard right now. I feel like I screwed up. I'm feeling guilty. Notice whatever's going on. Label it. Be mindful of it. But then you do the hard step for the type A folks. You say, and that makes sense. Screwing up is a common human experience. It makes sense that I'm feeling overwhelmed in the world that I'm in. It's a common thing. I shouldn't feel guilty about it. That's the common humanity step. But then you end with the nurture part. You do something nice to yourself. You say, I'm going to be kind to myself. How can I take something off my plate? How can I talk to myself like I would talk to a friend? And this idea of self-kindness, of talking to yourself like you would talk to a friend, I think is so important because sometimes we confuse the act of being compassionate with ourselves with the act of being self-indulgent. We think we're going to let ourselves off the hook. But if you really had a friend that was actively screwing up, hopefully you wouldn't scream at them like a drill instructor, but you might get curious. You'd probably be like, I just want to know what's going on. Can we figure this out? Can we problem solve? That's just what you do with yourself. You kind of turn on mentor problem solving mode. This is self-compassion, and you can use it for any of the motivational problems that come up when you're struggling. And it turns out it has a host of huge benefits. One is that self-compassion makes it easier to be nicer to your future self. People who Kristen Neff trains in these self-compassion strategies wind up eating healthier. They wind up exercising more. They wind up saving more for retirement. It's easier to kind of take a slight sacrifice in the present if you're not beating yourself up. She also finds that it's a wonderful way to reduce procrastination. You just get to those hard tasks earlier. And finally, she finds that if you exercise compassion with yourself when it's hard, it's also easy to exercise compassion with the people you care about, your friends, your teammates, your spouse, your kids, and so on. And so if you really want to motivate yourself in a healthy way, self-compassion seems to be the way to go. Makes you feel good and makes you perform better. Now we get to the final insight that I guess we get from the science of happiness, and it's one that might be even harder. If you can see, I'm kind of getting harder and harder for you insight leaders as we go across these 5 tips. And I think this one might be the hardest. It is that if you want to become happy, you need to become wealthy, but not in terms of money, in terms of time. In terms of money, you all got it. Insight leaders make tons of money. You guys are killing it, right? It's fine. That's good, but that doesn't matter. What matters more is that you're wealthy in time. What do I mean? Well, I mean to look at the phenomena of what researchers like Ashley Willens at Harvard Business School calls time affluence, the subjective sense that you have some free time. It's the opposite of what so many of us experience, which is what's often called time famine, where you're literally starving for time. And research finds that if you self-report being time famished, that's a huge hit on your well-being. In fact, some of Ashley's studies show that if you self-report being time famished, that's as big a hit on your well-being as if you self-report being unemployed. If all of you lost your jobs tomorrow, it would be a pretty sucky day. Just not having any free time is that bad. And you're all making the face that a lot of folks make when I talk about time affluence. You're like, oh God, this is really bad. So what can you do to get more free time? good thing about time affluence is it's not the objective amount of free time we have, it's our subjective sense of free time. It's kind of like what you all do. It doesn't have to be objectively how good a brand is, it's just our subjective sense of how it is. And so that means you can hack it using all the kinds of framing effects that you all use in your work. One of the interesting framing effects comes from spending your money to get back a little bit more time. I imagine that all of you have a little bit of discretionary income. You've probably bought takeout or something like that. My guess, though, is that even if you did that, you didn't frame it in terms of a time savings. But let's say you go get takeout, you buy some pad thai. How much time did you save? That was like, you didn't have to boil the noodles, and you didn't have to clean up after, you didn't have to look up the rest. What was that, hour and 25 minutes? What did you do with that time? You see that shift? It's like allowing you to realize that you have a little bit of extra time. You've purchased it for yourself. But an even bigger way to get back more time affluence is to make good use of the free time we do have. And this gets to a concept that the journalist Bridget Schultz has called time confetti. Time confetti is the little pieces of time that we have extra. You have 5 minutes when that Zoom meeting ends early, or the 10 minutes when your kid falls asleep faster than you expected. You don't think it's a lot of time, so you just blow it. You just go on Reddit or check your email or something. But research shows it adds up. In fact, some of Ashley Wallen's time surveys suggest we actually have more free time now than we did 15, 20 years ago. It's just broken up into tinier chunks. So use the chunks. Make what Ashley Rillins recommends a time confetti wish list, where you just write down things that you could do. Maybe that's text a friend. Maybe that's take a moment to be mindful about what's going on. Maybe that's taking a deep breath. All these little strategies I talked about can fit into these little pieces of time confetti. We just need to make it work that way. And so that is top insight number 5. Doesn't matter the wealth level that you get from the money, but it matters a lot the wealth level you get from time. So congratulations, you just did a whole Yale class in 20 minutes. If you want to learn more, I recommend heading to my website, drlauriesantos.com, where you can get the whole Yale class for free on Coursera.org. Or as Kyle mentioned, if you're too busy for a Yale class because you're very time famished, you can also check out my podcast, The Happiness Lab. But I hope I've convinced you that happiness matters in your industry and hopefully beyond. And I hope I've given you some strategies you can all use to get there. Thank you all so much.